same blooming place since 1952.
All right, 7 minutes after 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. The other day, a couple weeks ago actually, Robin and I went down to St. Petersburg, and we hadn't been there in a long, long time, and there was a place we used to go to called the Pier, and it had a building under that looked like an upside-down pyramid. So we wanted to see how it looked now, because we had heard that they had torn it down, and they were going to build something in its place. Well, they weren't done yet. So we only got as far as the very beginning of what used to be the Pier. Mm-hmm. And we were disappointed because we couldn't go see the Pier. But sitting right there was this museum, a baseball museum.
Yeah.
I said, well, let's take that in. Let's see what that is. You know, so we paid our $5 a piece.
Yeah.
I think it was $4 because we're old.
Yeah. Vinnie Cooper's.
And we went in there, and you see all these old baseballs that are all autographed, every single one of them. Not just necessarily by a baseball player, but also by like Walt Disney and Marilyn Monroe and people who had nothing at all to do with baseball. Well, I guess Marilyn Monroe did, right? She married Joe DiMaggio. So.
Yeah.
So the one thing that kind of occurred to me as I'm looking at these baseballs and the artwork that's up on the wall, the photographs, is that it seemed like an era more innocent or something, right? Mm-hmm. Baseball was a big thing, and it's still a big thing. It's probably a bigger thing now, I would guess, right? But sports in general were an innocent thing, right? Albert Chen is on the phone. He has a book you're going to want to read. It's called $1 Billion Fantasy: The High-Stakes Game Between FanDuel and DraftKings. Do you know those two?
Yes.
Let's see. Albert Chen is a senior editor at Sports Illustrated. It's an honor to have you on, Albert. Good morning.
Oh, it's great to be on.
Yeah, where are you?
I'm in New York City.
Are you? Okay, well, good. Are you familiar with this baseball museum down here in Florida?
No, I haven't. It sounds pretty amazing, though. So, what was your, the takeaway was that in a more innocent time,
right.
Maybe as things, I think my book is maybe about more maybe complicated times.
Right. That's kind of why I wanted to mention that, because, and it's I guess it's nobody's fault, but it's just the nature of us as human beings. We want to be competitive, even if we're not out there on the field.
Right, that's right, and I think that it's a much more complicated world, that's for sure. And what these two companies found was when they started FanDuel and DraftKings. I mean, they exploded in terms of advertising. Became for a minute just like the biggest advertisers in America. And what they really tapped into was what you were talking about, just kind of this kind of drive and spirit in, whether it's sports fans or not even sports fans, to just, a competitive nature that I think, whether it's fantasy sports or just sports in general, I think that's really what the heart of it is.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you could go back in time to those photographs we were looking at, and you mentioned fantasy sports, it would be like, what are you talking about? Nobody would have any idea what it even was. It's a hard sell to that generation, isn't it?
It's a hard sell to that generation, but I think that, I think it gets really to the core of, what following sports is about. Mm-hmm. And, it is about following, your favorite teams. But I think what fantasy sports what has actually made it a much more sort of personal thing where you feel like you're in control of the team, and so you're smarter than the general manager who has all this money is investing in overpaid players, and you can create a team that is better than the teams that are created by your friends and your competitors in your league. So going back to the 70s and maybe even before then, there were people in their dorm rooms and in college and 13-year-olds who during class were passing around notes with teams that they had put together or players they wanted to draft and maybe put some money on it. And at the end of the day, it's kind of yeah, it smells like gambling. It is a way to make things a little bit more interesting because cash is always going to have to be involved to make things a little bit more interesting. But it really, fantasy sports is, I think, more about the social aspect. For me, I've been in the same league for a few decades now, and I still am in the same league with a bunch of my high school friends, and that's really the only way we kind of keep in touch now.
And these two entities really took the office pools to the next level.
They did, and I think what the difference was the game that they actually offered, which was a variation of these fantasy sports games, essentially where you picked your own players, but you had the ability to win cash on a daily basis. And so that was a new form of fantasy sports. But what really was the game changer was the fact that these two companies were able to raise hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that at the end of the day, they burned through very, very quickly on advertising and acquired customers. Kind of a classic sort of startup story.
And that's where the scandals come in.
Yeah, that's where there was a scandal where an employee was accused of winning $350,000 playing these particular games on one side, but being on the employee of another side, and potentially, allegedly using insider information to do that. Now, he was cleared of any wrongdoing. I mean, there was an investigation into this. It was true that employees were playing, so that was a mistake really on the part of the companies. But it snowballed into a thing where it became such a big scandal, really, because the scandal was really, are these gambling operations that are operating and are invading our living rooms, every 90 seconds with our commercials. So that sort of became the scandal, and it was really about the legality of these businesses. And it was going to just take some time for this company to really just kind of at a state-by-state level pass fantasy sports bills and really just kind of survive. And then now here they are in 2019, positioned very well as sports gambling companies going forward.
I was going to ask you about the state-by-state thing. How is Florida in this?
Florida, as far as I know, you can play daily fantasy sports. Now, things happen so quickly. Now, you can't gamble in Florida. You certainly cannot gamble on your phones or anything close to the level of what you can do in, say, New Jersey. I can cross the George Washington Bridge and put down a bet, take out my phone and put down a bet
really?
for $20 on a team to win. But so it is it's a evolving process now. Florida's legality, I know that has been a particularly, interesting state there, but I don't know exactly what the latest there is.
Okay, so in New York you can't do it, but in New Jersey you can.
We're talking about sports gambling.
Right.
You can certainly play daily fantasy, which is the niche product of these two companies, but you can't sports gamble on your phone in New York. And in fact, there are only 13 states in the country, and Florida's not included, where you can bet on sports. And they're kind of like different degrees of how you can do that and where you can do that. But in the vast majority of states, you cannot sports gamble.
Did the people involved in the early days expect it to ever get as big as it did?
They did not expect it to certainly become, front page news on the New York Times for, unforeseen reasons. But I mean, their goal at a certain point was to become as big of a company as they possibly could,
Makes sense, yeah.
Maybe the Facebook of sports, the way they were going to change sports media. And look, they may still very well do that. We're not at the end of the story yet. But it was just a kind of, it got complicated when hundreds and hundreds of $millions, came into these companies. But they, wanted to grow. Now, did they have the product that could support that? That was an entirely different question. And it was sort of a race to become $1 billion company at a certain point. But, it turns out that, in retrospect, that race seemed a little bit too far accelerated.
Have they spawned other copycat companies?
Well, not only that, but I mean, a lot of companies came and went. Certainly long before DraftKings and before FanDuel came around, and they were companies that didn't succeed. And I think that one of the lessons of the story is that a lot of it is about timing. Certainly, I mean, for the DraftKings founders in Boston in 2012, when they started to get into this, it was a very, very favorable environment for them in that, there was a lot of money to go around from venture capital, and they were able to really take advantage of that. Now they were presenting a great vision and a great story. So going forward, it was all about them kind of catching up to the reality of that story. And it turns out, it seems like they did. Now, for FanDuel, they spent years trying to figure this out. There were many times, trust me, when they did not think that they were going to survive, but they were able to finally get to that point.
But you point out in your book that FanDuel was first, and it was like 3 years later that DraftKings came on the scene.
That's right. Yeah, it was 3 years later that DraftKings came along. Now, this happens all the time where there's one company and another company comes along in its sort of aftermath. And I think they learned that it just doesn't matter who comes up with the idea first. It's about how you execute it. And they did a great job with execution. They did a great job in terms of figuring out what their product was going to be. And, here they are now with an ability to really dominate this larger sports gambling market that is just becoming bigger and bigger.
So are you, I kind of want to ask about how the book was written, and I guess the best way to ask this is, are you a fan of this, and then you kind of sought out the players in order to write and get the interviews and write the book?
Yeah, I mean, I started playing back in 2014, just really out of just simply curiosity. I was just curious what these games were. I thought they were interesting when I started winning some money, but just very, very low stakes. And I was just interested in writing a story about them, so I wrote a story for Sports Illustrated. Now, when the scandal happened, clearly there was some book material there, but what was the book? And what I wanted to do was write a book for a broader audience. In fact, for people who can just pick up the book without any sort of knowledge, even of fantasy sports, and really no interest in gambling, and really be drawn to the characters at the middle of the story. And so it's really, really focused on just a handful of people at the center of the story. And what it is kind of a pretty human narrative, really interesting characters who just find themselves in a very, very interesting situation. And, it is focused on the founders in Boston who were in over their heads for, reasons that many first-time entrepreneurs are. They were just kind of learning this on the fly. And then you have 5 co-founders from the UK who, were not American fantasy sports fans. A good number of them weren't even sports fans, period. So it's really about just kind of this odd sort of story and how those two groups went head to head.
So when does it start? Like 2006? Is that when we go? Is that how far back we go?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, it's interesting because that was the year the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act was put into law, and that essentially allowed for kind of gave some clarity to the legality of fantasy sports. And what these two companies represented was this gray area, sort of in the middle of traditional fantasy sports and gambling.
Why couldn't they have been grandfathered into the states that also have dog racing and horse racing? You'd think all the rules would be the same.
Yeah, like us.
Yeah, well, I think it's very tricky because they had to present themselves not as gambling companies, and they had to present themselves, even when they stepped foot into Nevada, not as sports gambling companies. So, they presented themselves as fantasy sports companies, which makes sense in the sense that, it does resemble sort of season-long fantasy, traditional fantasy that's been played for decades. At the same time, it is really doesn't resemble at all in that you can win money just instantly, and it really is doesn't really have the social aspect to it at all, actually, because you're doing it all alone, sort of trying to go head-to-head with sort of a faceless opponent. So it's a completely different experience. So they kind of, the companies really sort of used the legality of traditional fantasy to their advantage, almost like this loophole in this act that I talked about, and really sort of, were able to kind of use that to parlay that into this new kind of game.
So was the government crackdown on this because of concern for the average consumer, or because of concern that there would be corruption on the actual field?
Oh, good question.
Well, the corruption is a great question. That relates more to, I would say, gambling. Now, they would be concerned about that if this was a much kind of bigger thing. I think that, if it got to a point where you're talking about this being played by, 20 million, 30 million players, then I think that those are big questions. Because gambling is so big, that is a big question that they're going to have to face going forward now in 2019, as more and more states pass these laws and more people can suddenly place a bet on a tennis match, on their phone, and maybe you're at the tennis match, and maybe, I don't know, there are just a lot of kind of endless, an endless list of concerns that are really sort of are related to this, and that's just something that they're going to have to address.
So does the development or evolution of technology make it safer or less likely to be corrupted?
Yeah, and that's another great question, because, it has allowed, certainly technology has allowed these companies to really thrive. FanDuel existed in a pre-mobile kind of era where no one was really, people were doing stuff on their BlackBerries, but it was really, you didn't have everyone using their iPhones. So it really opened things up from their standpoint, but I would argue that it has really sort of been, technology is really going to be a reason why this actually could work, is because of all these detection companies whose jobs essentially are to detect abnormalities in gambling. So if you have just an unusually high number of bets come in at a point where something, kind of strange is happening in a game, then yeah, they raise a red flag, and there are a lot of people who are going to take a very close look at this. And so, these companies, and the leagues really have a lot invested in making sure that the integrity of their sport is completely protected.
And your book reads like a novel, not like a textbook. You've got all of the players in there. Each player has their own personality, and it just sort of goes smoothly from one chapter to the other. I was amazed at that. That's a very interesting read for me.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. And that's kind of what, I wanted to do was, there are a lot of people who are covering this topic and on a day-to-day basis, and much more thoroughly than I am. But what I wanted to do was sort of present a broader story, a story for kind of a broader audience, and making these characters just kind of relatable and accessible to a lot of people.
And you're rooting for them. I found myself rooting for them. This is pretty amazing.
The book is called $1 Billion Fantasy, the high-stakes game between FanDuel and DraftKings that upended sports in America. Albert Chen is the author. It is number one in the sports gambling category right now on Amazon. And the book just came out like 2 days ago, I think, 2 or 3 days ago. Is that right?
Yeah, it came out 2 days ago.
Wow, how exciting is that for you? This is like a gamble for you. If you right, any author who does something and comes out number one in a 3-day period, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I'll take it. The stakes are pretty low for me, I would say. In terms of writing the book, to me, it was pretty much a no-brainer. The process was pretty amazing, so I feel good about it all around.
Well, you were kind enough to send us a copy. I would like to offer it to one of our listeners. So if we have somebody who would like it, just give us a call, 622-9622, and I'll set it aside for one of you. Do you have a different website you'd like to direct us to?
I would definitely encourage people to go to a website that sells the book and check it out there, all over wherever you normally buy books. And if you want to read more about the book, you can go to albertchenwrites.com, and that's sort of a landing page for the book for the moment.
And some people might think that it's all we're all males involved in this, but you had women too in the startup process, which I found pretty fascinating.
Sure. Yeah. I think that and part of the reason why I felt it was important to tell, look, there are a number of endless interesting characters and leaders of these companies, but certainly wanted to tell the story of Leslie Eccles, who was a co-founder and executive vice president of marketing, and really was sort of at the forefront of just the success of the company in the early years.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Albert, thank you. It was an honor to have you on the show. And for everybody else, go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or albertchenwrites.com. $1 Billion Fantasy. Thank you, Albert.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. We'll be right back.
When you see the Mike Scott Plumbing truck, you know that experienced certified technicians are on the job. Mike Scott Plumbing has the equipment and expertise to handle any size septic job, residential and commercial. From pumping septic tanks to installing new tanks and drain fields. When you want the job done right the first time, then the first call you need to make is to Mike Scott Plumbing. Mike Scott Plumbing is locally owned and operated since 1987, so you get the quality you expect at the price you deserve. If water runs through it, we do it. Mike Scott Plumbing. Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Fox News, I'm Chris Foster. Guidelines for impeachment hearings on President Trump are approved by the House Judiciary Committee.
This hearing is designed to set parameters for an impeachment inquiry related to alleged obstruction of justice. The resolution allows counsel to question witnesses, gives members access to documents in executive session, and allows the president and his lawyers to pose questions and respond.
Fox's Rachel Sutherland in Washington. House Democrats are divided on whether pursuing impeachment in the end is worth it. A fugitive couple is caught in Arizona.
Blaine and Susan Barksdale have long been wanted by police in Tucson, Arizona for the murder of a local man. And when they were finally apprehended in New York State, they were able to escape while being sent back to Arizona. They overpowered security officers during the transport midway through Utah by faking a medical emergency and surprising them.
Fox's Evan Brown. America's listening to Fox News.
Hayden, non-attorney spokesperson. Janelle & Associates Law Firm with principal office in Houston, Texas is responsible for the content of this ad. Attention all active or retired military. If you are diagnosed with tinnitus or hearing loss after using yellow and black or yellow and olive dual-ended earplugs, you may be entitled to significant cash compensation. These earplugs permitted damaging sounds to enter the ear canal. If you served in the military and were later diagnosed with hearing loss or tinnitus, call 800-689-5173 right now to see if you qualify for significant cash compensation. The manufacturer knew of the defects but did not warn its customers. Complaints allege that the manufacturer manipulated test results to make it appear that the plugs met government standards. If you deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan anytime from 2003 through 2015 and are now suffering from diagnosed hearing loss or tinnitus, you may be entitled to significant cash compensation. Call 800-689-5173 right now. Hurry, time is limited. Call 800-689-5173 now to see if you qualify for cash compensation. Call 800-689-5173. That's 800-689-5173. 800-689-5173.
Hi, this is Will.
And this is Wendy of Dex Imaging in Gainesville and Ocala. You know, we live and work in this community just like you, and we wanted to personally invite you to call us with any questions or concerns about your copiers or printers.
Like, how can I save money on my toner? That stuff's expensive.
In most cases, a complimentary workflow analysis has shown we can save your business 20 to 30% on printing cost.
Have you been kicking around the idea of going paperless? Are you considering a document management solution? Maybe you just want to ask some questions, but don't want to be bombarded by aggressive salespeople.
Give us a call. We'll be happy to answer your questions and show you how you can save money with our award-winning copiers and printers and our amazing service team.
Who, in case you didn't know, will be there in 4 hours or less to service your machine guaranteed, and we have a 97% first-time fix rate. Check us out at deximaging.com or give us a call.
In Ocala, dial 352-433-4090. That's 43.